there is one special case related to the stopwatch that we need to handle separately. And that is when we start measuring time for a particular activity, we can see that this time will be changing on the activities page as well as on the progress page. But the thing is that if we refresh the page while being on a different page other than timeline, we will see that the time is no longer updating. And this is because we are checking that one of our timeline item objects is active and start the timer for the timeline item object only on the timeline page. But in this case, timeline page is never created because we have just refreshed the page while being on a different page. So to handle this case and always start the timer regardless of the page where we open up our application, we have to register global timer that will be automatically started every time we open our application. So we can implement the logic to handle global timer inside timeline items module, since this logic is related to timeline item resource. Right here, let's declare a variable to hold the reference to our timer. Let's call this variable timeline item timer. Initial value will be null. And down here, we're going to create two functions that are going to manage our global timer. First function is going to start global timer, and the second function will be used to stop the global timer. Let's call this function stop timeline item timer, like this. But of course, we should start the timer only if we have active timeline item object. In other words, if we have previously left our application while our timer was running. So let's find an active timeline item by doing the following. We're going to iterate over timeline items array, and if property is active will be true for one of timeline item objects. That means active timeline item exists, and we're gonna store a reference to this object in active timeline item constant. And as a reminder, we have added isActive property to every timeline item object in one of the previous lessons. So now we have to register the function that will be executed every second, because we have to update the time every second. So right here, I'm going to call setInterval function to register global timer, which is going to update active timeline item object. And specifically, we have to update property called activity seconds. There is a function that we have created before called update timeline item, which accepts timeline item object as the first parameter that we have to update, and as a second parameter, it accepts array of overwritten fields. So we're going to update activity seconds property by incrementing it by 1 every second, like so. Also, let's specify that we'd like to run this callback every second. I'm gonna use milliseconds in a second constant. And also, to achieve better separation of concerns, we can extract this part of code into a separate function. Let's call this function find active timeline item, which we're going to declare right here. Let's paste that line in here and return the result. And as for another function, stop timeline item timer, the implementation will be pretty simple, since the only thing we have to do in here is to clear our global timer, which we can do by calling clearInterval function. And as a first parameter, we need to pass the reference to that timer we would like to stop. Of course, these functions are not going to do anything unless we call them. So we need to start the global timer every time we will start our application. That means we can call the function start timeline item timer inside of our main module. So right here, I'm going to call that function, which should be imported from timeline items module. So now let's check the result. What happens if I will load the application, and right away we're seeing an error in the console saying that cannot access property activity seconds. And that is because there is a possibility that we will not have any active timeline item objects. And this can happen if we'll close our application while none of our timers is in a running state. So to avoid this error before actually starting the global timer, we firstly have to check if we have at least one active timeline item. So let's call the function findActiveTimelineItem in here, or we can do it in a different way. Firstly, let's create a constant ActiveTimelineItem and store a reference to the ActiveTimelineItem in this constant, like this. So let's add an import for this function right here, and then to tell which timelineItem object the timer should be started, we're going to pass this object as the first parameter to startTimelineItem timer function. And then going back to the implementation of this function, instead of actually calling the function to find ActiveTimelineItem, we're going to accept ActiveTimelineItem object as the first parameter. And before checking everything in the browser, let's export findActiveTimelineItem function, because we're using it inside main.js. So it's finally time to check it out. Let's start tracking the time for some activity, and then make sure this time will be increasing on the progress page. But what's most important is that this time should be updating after page refresh. And this is exactly what is happening. As we can see, timer keeps running. And this is due to that global timer that we have started right before our application was initialized. But now we have a different problem. So if I'm gonna go back to timeline page and try to stop this timer, we can see that the time will still be increasing. And this is because every timeline stopwatch component has its own timer, which gets initialized when the timeline page is opened. But the thing is that we never stopped that previously started global timer. And currently we have two timers running at the same time. The first one we can stop by clicking on the stop button, but another timer, which is global, we cannot stop because we never called the function stopTimelineItem timer. So let's determine where we need to call that function to stop the global timer. And probably the best place to do it will be inside of the timeline page component, because we know that this page contains individual timeline stopwatch components, and each of those components has its own timer. So those components will handle stopping and starting timer themselves. But right before that, when the timeline page component gets initialized, let's call the function stopTimelineItem timer to stop the global timer before each of those individual timer components will be created. And in this case, we don't need to additionally check if we have active global timer, because anyway, if we're gonna call function clearInterval and pass timer which is not running, clearInterval function is not gonna cause any error. And just to better see when our global timer will be started and stopped, I'm going to add a couple of console log statements inside of both of these functions, in here as well as inside of startTimelineItem timer function. So in the browser, once I'm gonna start tracking the time for a particular activity, on the progress page, let's make sure this time will be increasing, and right after I refresh the page, I will see one log entry, which means the global timer was started. And that is why we're still seeing that the time for coding activity is updating. And this global timer should be stopped once I'm gonna switch to timeline page. And there we go, we see another log entry, which means that the global timer was stopped. But still, stopwatch time is increasing, because, as I said before, each of these timeline stopwatch components has its own logic to handle the timer that belongs to it. And we can continue manage this timer by stopping and stopping it. At the end, let's go back to the editor and remove those two console log statements. The link to the source code of this project, as always, will be in the video description.